We all have our opinions, but how often do we stop to ask, what if I'm wrong? In today's media landscape, it's easy to slip into an echo chamber of our own making, where we're only shown the stories that confirm what we already believe. That's why I use Ground News. It's an app and website that lets you compare how different news outlets, left, right, and center, are covering the same story. It breaks down media bias, tracks news publication ownership, and even highlights the stories your usual sources might be overlooking. And with the new bias comparison feature, you can see summaries of how various political perspectives are framing the exact same event, helping you understand the fuller picture. None of us are immune to bias, but Ground News gives you the tools to question, compare, and think critically about the news you consume. Go to ground.news to check it out. And if you use my link in the show notes, you'll get 15% off your subscription. I'm your host, Michael Callahan. This is Where We Go Next. And this week, I have the pleasure of speaking with Andy Mills. If you listen to podcasts, or you know anyone who listens to podcasts, you're probably familiar with Andy's work. He was a co-creator of The Daily, the award-winning podcast for the New York Times that is listened to by millions of people each and every week. He's also created, produced, and edited some other series you may have heard of, including Rabbit Hole, Caliphate, and The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. By my lights, Andy is a deeply thoughtful, intentionally curious human. And that is readily apparent in his newest show, Reflector, co-created with Matthew Bohl. We get into a lot in this conversation, like why has storytelling become increasingly political over the last decade? What happens when politics comes to fill a space in society that religion used to? And how do we get to the truth of an event that involves multiple, valid perspectives? If there's a through line over the next hour and a half, it's a call to reject what Andy refers to as the arrogance of certainty. So, let's get to it. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael.
Well, I'm glad that it's a pleasure all around. Now, there is a little bio snippet that you sent me before we started recording, and I want to just pick out a piece of it to start our conversation. You said, quote, "I believe that stories are essential for human societies and that good journalism embraces the elements of great storytelling," end quote.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of a line taken from Joan Didion's 1979 essay collection, The White Album, in which she writes, quote, "We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of a narrative line upon disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience," end quote. And I agree with Didion that we, quote, "tell ourselves stories in order to live. Humans are storytelling animals, after all." Or to quote the great Nancy Rommelman, quote, "People will voluntarily go longer without eating than they will without listening to or telling stories," end quote. But my larger question to you, Andy, to start us off, is storytelling compatible with the pursuit of truth and of what's real?
Absolutely. I can see all the ways in which it can be dangerous. I mean, I think Yuval Noah Harari in his book Sapiens, I think has fun pointing out how important stories are and how amazing they are and how essential they've been to the human progress, but also that the universe actually isn't a story, that the hard, cold reality isn't a great narrative. And I think both of those things can be true. It's just, for whatever reason, evolution, maybe some people believe there's some kind of design behind it, humans interact with the world through stories. And I think that that's one of the most interesting things about us. And I think that you have to just acknowledge that it's true and then deal with the headaches that can come with that, right? It's not ideal sometimes that we're this way. If we were more Dr. Spock-like, and we were obsessed with logic, we'd have a different world than the narrative obsession that instead is somehow deeply undergirding our being, our societies, our sense of ourself.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, I think about storytelling all the time, but I've been thinking about it specifically in relation to what just happened. We're talking shortly after the 2024 election. And, there's always the after the fact reporting where everyone's like, the story of the election was X. No, the story of the election was Y. It was actually that more college educated white people thought this way about this. And so they, leaned towards Kamala, but actually working class Hispanic voters went this way because they believe this and went this way. And there's a part of me, and I can't remember if I'm paraphrasing Ezra Klein or it could be someone else, but this idea that like, we don't really know what motivated voters exactly to do what they did, because often, and I imagine you have experience with this, and we'll get into this as well as it relates to your podcasting work and your journalism, is that even when someone tells you something that they believe to be true, that might not actually be true. Someone could say, I voted for this person because of the economy, and they might actually believe it, but that might not actually be true. And so I guess the larger question, and maybe it's an impossible one to answer, that I'm sort of getting at is, since we tell stories to each other and we tell ourselves stories all the time that give our lives meaning, that give our lives purpose, but even the stories we tell ourselves might just be completely fabricated.
I think you're onto something. I think the word I would quibble with is
quibble away.
The idea that it's completely fabricated is the thing to avoid. And I think good storytelling shies away from certainty and embraces humility. I think that there's a reason, there's a whole genre called melodrama, right? In a melodrama, the good guys are good guys, the bad guys are bad guys, and the audience clearly knows who they are, and they experience no change, right? And it can be, entertaining medium. It has had a long history, especially in the 19th century. It was very popular in plays and stuff. But I think that it especially is tricky when you try and tell a story about reality. When you fall into melodrama, I think people naturally have skepticism for it. Now, it can also be a powerful tool. The story that Donald Trump was telling at times was a melodrama, right? The illegal immigrants were clearly the bad guys. There was no attempt in his political storytelling to grapple with why people would want to come to America and even would be willing to break laws and take huge risks to be here. Now, he's not interested in the nuances of that story. He's instead using them as a character in a story that he's telling about himself and how he is willing to deal with problems that previous politicians pretended weren't there. He's using it as a storytelling tactic to say that his political opponents are unwilling to grapple with the reality that the American people see in front of them every day. And that is a powerful storytelling tool. Whether you agree with Donald Trump or not, I think you're referencing this storytelling we're doing after the fact. A lot of people are trying to be responsive to the power of his storytelling and the way that his campaign overcame hurdles that previously in other political times in American history would have been insurmountable. There were just so many things that Donald Trump has said. There's been so many scandals around him that previously have sunk the political careers of others, and they don't sink his. And I think that curiosity compels people to say, okay, so what's happening here? What's going on here? And so to go back to your question about stories that are just completely untrue that we get stuck in, obviously we do versions of this all the time, and it can be really dangerous. I think one of the most common versions of this you see in society is around a breakup, where each half of that breakup has a different story about why there was a breakup. And often it paints the other person as the one who was to blame, right? But the thing is, it's not completely untrue. There is always some truth to it. And that is a way that we tell a story less as a declaration of certainty. This is absolutely what happened. And it's more about how we try and grapple with what is happening. I have to give it a story shape one way or another. So here's how I'm trying to answer the question of why did Donald Trump get elected or why did we break up? It's just a very human instinct. And I think that we just have to embrace it, that that's going to be the ways that we operate. And then we bring values to it like humility and I think a real allergy to certainty. To know that the story that I'm telling myself isn't totally true is, I think, compatible with still trying to tell yourself a story. Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to belabor this point a little bit more because I think it's important and relevant because it's the very thing that I think Reflector, your newest podcast that you're doing with Matthew Bowl, really digs into. I'm going to use a hypothetical example here to kind of hammer home this point. So imagine there's a single mom and she moves away from her family. She works 60-hour weeks because she wants to give her daughter, her only child, the life and the comforts that she never had as a kid, the one that she always dreamt of as a child. So imagine a mother who would sacrifice everything for her daughter. But then from her daughter's perspective, her daughter grows up and she tells the story of her childhood with a deep resentment about a mother who wasn't there, who pulled her away from her cousins and childhood friends, a mother who ignored her daughter's needs, right?
Absolutely.
You ask the mom, you ask the daughter, and both of them are telling you the truth. And as an outsider, you can see the mom genuinely believed that she was giving her daughter a better life, and the daughter genuinely resented her mother for whatever she perceived her mother to be lacking in terms of what she wanted as a kid. But you ask two different people the same thing, and one person is the hero of the story. You ask another person, and that person's the villain of the story.
Mm-hmm.
When we're trying to figure out who the protagonist or antagonist of a given story is, or who the good guy or the bad guy of a given story is, depending on who you ask, you will get a different answer. So how do we know what is actually true?
By listening to both stories. That's what's powerful about the hypothetical that you lay out, is that if you just cling tightly to one of those stories, if you say, no, the mom is the one who's right here. The daughter is just another example of how there's a whole generation that's been fed victimization and they blame their parents for everything. Like, you're going to miss half of the human experience that's at play here. And I think that you're going to miss out on reality. You're going to miss out on something fascinating and interesting and revealing. The work of good storytellers is to grapple with the fact that these experiences are mapping onto reality for these two individuals, even though they're using the storytelling to describe the same situation so differently. It's trying to say, well, how do we now grapple with the fact that these two stories are grounded in the truth? I'll just bring an example from my own life because you brought up this hypothetical. I have siblings and we didn't have a good home life growing up. And there was a lot of friction, I think is safe to say, with our stepmother, who suffered from severe depression and undiagnosed bipolar disorder, I believe. And it was really hard to live with her. And all of my siblings have reacted very differently as adults to the experience we had as kids. And one of my sisters has had a really hard time not being resentful and angry and continuing to play out how things could have been different for us and how we could have had the sort of childhood that other kids had. One of the things that I will tell her is, without trying to tell her that her story is wrong, I will tell her another story, right? And this story is about my stepmother. Take it out of the context of my actual stepmother. And I'll just tell her like a fairy tale, right? Imagine that there's a little girl who's raised by monsters. And these monsters, from the time that she's very little, are trying to convince her that she too is a monster. And at a certain point, she believes that she's a monster and she behaves accordingly. And then she grows up and the world treats her like a monster. And so she has every reason to think that she is one, and she treats other people like she's a monster. Now, in that fairy tale, if someone comes along and says, I see you, I know that you're not a monster. I know that all these people have convinced you that you are, but you really aren't. Don't you want to be on that side? Like, should we continue to push this person into thinking that she's a monster? And it's a reminder that, my stepmother is a whole person who has a past and who's grappling with her own story and her own sense of herself. And it doesn't rob my sibling of her story of how things were unjust and wrong for her growing up, but it is expanding that story to include, my stepmother's. And I think it's hard, but I think that there's something in what you're pointing at. There's something here that's like, this is just what it means to be a responsible, curious, gracious person who's truly trying to engage with the world around them. And it isn't to say we should deny stories and run away from stories. We can't, right? We're stuck. Like I said, we're stuck with being story obsessed beings, but it's how do we expand and open ourselves up to all these different stories as we try and grapple with something that is the truth. And I think maybe some people listening could think, well, is this guy one of these like postmodern, there's your truth and my truth? Fuck no. I absolutely think that that's absurd.
Cue Jordan Peterson impression.
Exactly.
What is the truth, man?
It is possible for us to acknowledge, as I said, Yuval Noah Harari does, right? That the world is not a story, that reality isn't actually a great narrative. We can acknowledge that and bring that humility to our storytelling as we know that we have to tell stories. And it's just, don't get so caught up with certainty in your own story and in your own interpretation of things that you don't have room. It's more about trying to use stories to grapple with the truth, knowing you're never quite going to get there.
It reminds me of a quote from a podcast mini-series of sorts that you produced for the New York Times called Rabbit Hole, which was about the internet's most popular apps and what they're doing to us. And the quote was, this one night I was at dinner with this guy who was sharing this very hyperbolic view about something. And I remembered as he was sharing, I think I read this almost word for word on Twitter today. And I asked him, is this what you really think? Or is this what you read online? And he paused and was like, I don't know. I don't know if I'm paying enough attention to what the difference between those two things is, end quote. And it's got me thinking about, in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about our own beliefs, and how the internet is just this fire hose of information that's both true, but also largely probably false. And how on a subconscious level, we can absorb these stories that we just glance at on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And I'm guilty of this myself, where it's like, is that actually what I think? Is that actually my own opinion? Or am I just regurgitating it because I think it is the correct opinion, or because I think it would make me sound cool if I said it? And I don't know if you've struggled with this problem yourself, Andy, but like I'm actually finding it harder and harder sometimes to actually trace the origin of some of my thoughts or thinking around things than it used to be in the pre-internet phase of my life. Do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit of a leg up when it comes to this, just because I was raised as a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and I really, really believed in the foundational creeds that I was taught. Later in life, I went to a Christian college to be some sort of minister. And while there, really grappling with what I felt was my calling to the ministry and grappling with my education and learning more about theology and the Bible, I came to realize that there were a number of beliefs that I was just holding because someone said so, or holding because this is just what everyone I know believes. And I realized how, number one, how limiting that can be. And number two, how much more fun and interesting it is to pull back away from the dogma and away from the certainty, and to just wrestle with like, okay, what actually is the truth? And where is the thing that I've always assumed to be the truth? Where are the holes in this? And I've taught myself over, the course of my entire adult life to build up that exercise, to kind of day in and day out be aware that this is just a natural state that human beings go into. Ooh, that feels true. I saw this meme. Gosh, that really feels true. And then to say, okay, as soon as I feel that, I've taught myself to go, all right, but is it? All right, well, maybe it is sort of, but what else is going on here? And I think that that's a kind of step in social evolution that we are going to have to grapple with. The internet has what sprung up in the 90s and become a big part of our lives in the next decade. But in the past decade, oh my gosh, it's social media and the things we see on the internet. They have replaced the minister in the pulpit. They have replaced the temple where you might go to worship. They are the place where people are getting the foundational beliefs about reality, about themselves, their countrymen, right? And just as you would hope an enlightened, thoughtful person would bring a sort of skepticism to the pulpit, I think we just have to bring that to every meme, to every tweet, to everything we see. And this is the whole purpose of the series Rabbit Hole. It's a little bit dated now, but I think it still holds up in a number of ways, because it was about how the internet was becoming the most dominant way that people were getting their views. And that when you lift up the hood and you look closely at what views are coming your way on the internet, there was every reason to be skeptical of those views, that the forces behind the algorithms and the forces behind what you are likely to encounter were not the forces that you would intentionally want to put behind the thing that's shaping your views, right? And so it was an attempt to tell people to notice the water that they were swimming in. And I think that that is the task of we who are living through this absolutely fascinating revolution of technology, this insanity that is the internet, that is the smartphone, that is, the waking up every morning. And if you want to, you can just, before you crawl out of bed, flip on this little robot phone and it could show you things that, 100 years ago, you might never see in a lifetime. And you could just scroll through them right there in your bed, and helping people to notice what's going on and then to actively participate in that world with some sort of values that they think are worthy of a good life or worthy of the pursuit of whatever, values or truth that you want to pursue. I think that that is an important task for us as journalists and just as citizens for one another to remind each other of this. Because yeah, as much as I made the Rabbit Hole series, it was like my dream to if we could only get these reporters and these stories, it could be so powerful. And I'm really proud of it. Even as I did it, it's not like I wasn't guilty of some of this too, right? I still fall prey to some of these things, even though I myself have been so committed to shining a light on this reality. I'm as susceptible as other people when I see that meme or when I see some article that has a headline that's 100% geared to pump me up and go, yeah, see, look, this proves everything you thought was right. And everybody who doubted you, they were wrong.
These guys suck. Our team rocks.
Exactly. And I think to go back to storytelling, the truth is that it's just not a good story. That's one thing that I'd point out too. When you see a melodrama, when you see headlines or you see stories that are this person that you already disagree with, he or she super sucks, and here's why, it's not a compelling story. It's probably not very true. It's probably not very helpful. The reality is just not that black and white.
Can I push back on that a little bit?
Yeah, push back.
I agree that at least when it comes to our day-to-day, it's definitely not a good story to adhere to because life is way more complex than that. But humans why does Star Wars endure, right? I think there's something deep within our brains, maybe from, thousands of years ago when we were tribal and you couldn't trust anyone who wasn't from your tribe. Or maybe it's part of the reason why humans invented religion. And I deeply connect with your own background, speaking as someone who broke up with his first girlfriend because she wanted to have sex before marriage. And so I prayed to God and took God's advice and broke up with her. So I totally, I totally relate to how you lost your faith. I lost mine in undergrad as well. It was maybe still to this day, the most painful period of my life. I felt like I was losing a core part of myself.
Absolutely.
But that idea that in terms of good storytelling, the storytelling we seem to be most attracted to and love that endures over the centuries is usually the storytelling that simplifies it to an us versus them, good versus evil narrative, which I think is why we are drawn to that kind of storytelling in our politics. But I agree with you that it's not healthy.
You're right. And this is something that I'm trying to grapple with as well, especially as I think about the distrust in journalism and in the media and try and put it into historical context. This is a big thing we do at Reflector. We try to tell stories that give context to the moment that we're in because we find it to be really powerful and helpful. And also it's just non-ideological. Context is context, everybody appreciates it and it makes for, I think, a compelling story. But I've been looking back at the late 19th century in an era of journalism often called the yellow journalism. And it was characterized by a lot of sensationalism and a lot of hyperbole, a lot of titillating. Essentially, the newspaper business, which had been booming, there was so many newspapers back then, it's almost hard to believe. In Springfield, Illinois, in just one city, there were 16 newspapers. It's hard for us to even believe.
It's too many newspapers.
Yeah, it was a booming time in the 19th century for newspapers, and they had gotten into a bit of a battle over who can have the most sensational, attention-grabbing headlines. And of course, those were painting the world in black and white, and those were preying off of people's fears, and they were taking a kernel of truth and ramping it up to be a titillating story that, you had to read extra, read all about it, right? This is where we get this kind of notion of the the newsie standing on the street saying, sensational things, read about it here in the newspaper, right? That is attractive. And I think that keeps coming back in cycles. I think we're experiencing some of that now. And so it's undeniable that it in some ways must resonate with us and a core part of who we are. Otherwise, we wouldn't be picking up that paper, right? So I do think that you're right. But for me, I think of it almost as like the body knows that it shouldn't eat sugar, but for whatever evolutionary reasons,
even as we eat it,
we have a hard time not going for the donut, not going for the sweets. I especially am guilty of this. I love sweets so much. And it's hard to know where the limits can be. If I'm just listening to the desire, it can be very hard for me to not reach for the sweets. But then I also am thinking, oh, but long term, I know that I sleep better and I feel better when I have a healthy diet, right? So I think that there's some kind of metaphor there where like we gorge ourselves and we find ourselves in yet another yellow journalism cycle because we wanted to be titillated, but then we have the hangover, right? We have the bad sleep. We have all the effects of a poor diet. And then there's another part of us that wants to survive, that knows that this will kill me if I keep doing it, that clicks in and says, no, okay, I actually need to cut back. I need to put things into my body that are more healthy. And I think that there's a similar thing at play with journalism. The yellow journalism era worked because people bought the newspapers, right? But then what came next? Because eventually it got to the point where no one trusted what they read in the news anymore. So they weren't buying it. And that's when you get, Adolph Ochs buying the New York Times as they were struggling and saying, you know what? What if instead we go with fact-based journalism and that becomes our brand, all the news that's fit to print? And you know what? What if we get rid of all this partisanship? And what if we do investigations? We'll become the newspaper that you can trust, and that'll be our brand. And that ended up destroying the competition, right? It's been over a century, and the New York Times has still managed to find success with that brand as much as they have been struggling internally and externally with whether or not they're living up to that mission in the past decade. But you can see it in the historical cycle, right? People wanted it. It did well for a while, but then it tipped the scales too far, and something like the revamped New York Times suddenly won the day, and then others followed suit, right? Because they wanted to sell newspapers and they realized, wow, the titillating headlines and the scandal mongering of 10 years ago is no longer selling. I think that there's something that we could learn from that here too. So I think we'll probably see it in our politics, that we go through these different cycles of wanting someone who will go in and smash things up, who will call a spade, and who will, scratch the us versus them part of who we are. And then after a while, especially if they don't do the things that we think they're going to do, we say, actually, I want the nuanced person again, And I think in some ways, maybe this is too high-minded, Billy. I think that when you look at the politics and you look at the, success and lack of success and trust and falling trust in journalism with something like 100-year time frame, instead of just looking at it day in, day out, when you zoom back and you look at it in context, I think one of the things you see is just that we are a very social species and we go through these different cycles. It's fascinating and interesting, and it's not always obvious then what should be done. If that's your primary goal is to sell newspapers, then you have a different mandate in 1868 than you do in, 1925.
Well, on that topic, let's talk about the podcast that you co-created with your friend and creative partner, Matthew, that you almost named Parable. Here's a quote from a conversation you had with Nick Gillespie for Reason. Quote, "Our goal is that we tell stories that are well-reported, nonpartisan, open-minded, curiosity-driven, but that if you listen to them hard, you find that you're not only thinking about the subject at hand, but you think afterwards about things that we never even mentioned. You're kind of left reflecting." End quote. Tell us about why you and Matthew started Reflector.
Well, the real story is just that we have a bunch of stories that we want to tell, didn't really know where else to tell them, didn't really know what outlets would be interested in publishing them. And so we thought, well, let's make our own show and just see what happens and try and tell these stories as best we can. Just the two of us. We are two people who have previously had much larger resources and bigger staff. And so we thought, well, it's going to be hard, but let's just see what we could do here and see how people respond. Matt and I are very sincere guys. We met at Christian college and went through the eras of skepticism and doubt and embracing uncertainty and complexity over the dogmas that we once held. And we both, like you said, went through the mourning that comes with losing such a core part of your identity. But then we got to the really exciting part of wow, the world is just so much more fucking interesting than we ever thought. This is actually quite thrilling to realize that it's all more complicated and that, we don't have to bury our heads in the sand and, go around thinking that we're totally right about everything and that anyone who disagrees with us is an idiot. It's just a better way to live. And it's part of what drew us to be journalists in the first place. And so being two sincere guys, we asked ourselves, what work is worthy of our time? A lot of people don't get the opportunity to ask that. They just have to do the job that they have at hand. But for a number of reasons, Matt and I were in a position to dedicate, some months, maybe some years of our lives to only pursuing the stories that were really worth going after and only working on things that we felt were, at the end of the day, worth all the time and effort that it took to do them. And then it led to this. It led to Reflector, that, okay, telling stories that are helping us grapple with the world around us, but each being a little parable is what we want to do. Like you said, we almost called the show Parable because we do think that the kind of best stories out there, on their surface, they're just interesting and you want to know what's going to happen next. But also, if they're told with the kind of thoughtfulness and a little humor here, and they're told with attention to the subtleties of what's going on inside of the stories, that they will open up people's minds to think deeper about things that are never even mentioned in the story that you just told. And this is a thing that I've had at the core of my work for many years. It's my favorite kind of story to consume, and it's the one that I'm always trying to make. So, the Rabbit Hole series that you brought up, on its surface, it's about the ways in which algorithms and the forces behind what you see on the internet are at play. But ultimately, it's a story about how we should be full of more skepticism and how we should value things like uncertainty and doubt. And we should be more curious than we are enraged, and that we should be prepared to pump the brakes a little bit when something we see on the internet gets our juices going. And that doesn't exactly ever get said in the podcast, but it's a theme that's running throughout it. So yeah, that's essentially the Reflector mission and the philosophy behind what we're up to.
Looking through some of the episodes of Reflector, the debut episode was about alcohol addiction and the medications that can be used to treat it, how rap lyrics can feature in criminal trials, sex, gender, and free speech, U.S. election rigging claims. Is there a binding tissue that guides you and Matt to cover a given story? What would you say is the through line that undergirds Reflector?
Well, I think what we want to do is be aware of the fact that we are living at a time of partisanship where people are consuming media from people who they largely agree with on politics. And it's just a different world than it was 10, 15 years ago when I entered it professionally. I remember loving This American Life and loving Radiolab, and they were two of the shows that made me go, okay, this is a medium that's interested in telling the sorts of stories that I want to tell. So I'm going to learn how to do this, and I'm going to get involved and get a job and make this my career. And at the time, I never considered how Ira Glass voted. I never thought about how the hosts of Radiolab voted, or I just never even considered their politics.
Yeah.
But I think that if you listen to those shows over the past few years, it's undeniable. You know who they vote for. You know what their politics are. And that's not just true of those two shows. That's true of so much of the media that we consume. And I don't think that it's necessarily good for us. And I think it's part of the reason that we're seeing in, Gallup polls that say that people just do not trust the media anymore. And so Matt and I try and choose stories that are interesting no matter what your politics are. And there are things that would draw a politically diverse audience together to consume the same story. And then we also are looking for stories that are pregnant with a deeper meaning, a deeper question. And we're okay leaving that question unanswered. I think those are the elements that we're often going for.
Strongest compliment I can give Reflector is that it reminds me of the NPR that I used to listen to every week, sometimes every day. It reminds me of the NPR that I used to love that has kind of gone away. And thinking back on the history of journalism that you just recounted and like the upsurge of yellow journalism, but that was all kind of incentive driven, right? Like this newspaper is doing these outrageous headlines. So our headlines have to be even more outrageous to attract a wider audience. But then in that cacophony came an opportunity for a newly revamped New York Times to come in and as the differentiator say, hey, as a alternative to all that yellow noise, we're going to tell you the truth as best as we can. And I do wonder, again, thinking about the election, I think that a lot of what you're speaking to that I've noticed, and that I think a lot of the listeners of this show have noticed, is that same thing of like, wow, how did everything get so political all the time? How is every radio show that I'm listening to start off with someone, saying, this is what I believe and this is where I stand and these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, and this kind of like absence of nuance. I think it's really been incentive driven, but I think that, at least I'm sensing, I think there's an exhaustion that's happening. And I think there's an opening, a widening opening for a similar version of what you described within the New York Times 100 years ago, where people are like, I'm kind of tired of being preached to every single time I listen to something. And I'm hoping that's kind of where things are heading. And it seems like that's a wave that you're hoping to ride with Reflector.
Yeah, that's the thing that I hope for our industry, that I hope for our society. And that's the bet that I'm going to make. And whether I fail or not, it's the future that I want. So I'm going to pursue it and just hope that you're right. Hope that this is a moment in history where we're seeing that yellow journalism cliff again, where people go, oh, yeah, actually, I want to trust again. I want to turn to things that don't just confirm my beliefs. But I mean, I don't know how it's going to play out. And I'm obviously not just in a vacuum here. I am friends with people at the Times, at the Post, at NPR, and we regularly talk about the forces at play in these newsrooms. And they're also not sure of the future. I'll just share specifically about the New York Times.
Yeah.
There are people who work at the New York Times who don't think that the Times should continue to fulfill its mission about nonpartisanship, about, independence and fairness and curiosity. They think that we are living through a particularly dangerous time and that Donald Trump and other forces like white supremacy are such a social danger, and that the Times needs to embrace the fact that it is a political player and needs to fight for the right side of history, needs to fight as a part of the resistance. And it's not just a couple of journalists. There's a lot of people there. And I think in 2020, the public saw some of how this conflict internally was playing out, especially around the ouster of the editor, James Bennett. He was not only the head of the opinions and editorial section of the New York Times, but he was next in line to be the editor-in-chief. Once the current editor-in-chief, Dean Baquet, stepped down, everyone knew that he was likely to be his replacement and be the guy who was in charge of the New York Times, right? It's the biggest job, is one of the most powerful jobs in media right now. And he lost his job in what essentially was like an office politics drama that played out on Twitter. And no one that I spoke to, no one thought it was justice. It was classic scapegoating. It was out of sync with the mission of the Times to have that happen. And yet there are people who think that it was morally a victory, that yes, maybe he was scapegoated, but morally this had to happen. And those forces are still in these newsrooms at NPR. They're at every major mainstream outlet, that some people there want journalism to fight for certain sides and certain political issues, while other journalists are saying, no, we should stay independent because we have to stay trustworthy. And if we're just seen as another tool for the Democratic Party, yes, Democrats will tune in, but how will we have any standing when we, publish something that we're hoping has an impact on the society? Well, only half the society trusts us. Only one side in the political spectrum trusts us. That's no good. And I think that we're going to see those two battle out. And I'm very curious of what's going to happen in the coming months, because The last time I checked in with two of my favorite journalists at the New York Times, people who are very committed to the ideals of their mission, to have no favor towards one political party or another. They see themselves neither pro-Trump nor anti-Trump. They're not pro-Biden or anti-Biden, right? They are there to try and grapple with the truth, to try and report accurately, with curiosity as a driving factor and not one political movement or another. And they told me that on the one hand, they don't think that a James Bennett ouster would happen now, or, I myself got caught up in one of these office politics, turned onto Twitter, public shamings, and I myself was ousted, not as drastically as James Bennett, but in my own way. They all say, James Bennett and you are fine now. That wouldn't happen in the newsroom of today. And yet they still feel like they're outnumbered, that their dedication to what journalism and, their particular kind of journalism stands for, like what journalism looks like and what healthy role it plays in a pluralistic democratic society. They say that they know that they have allies, and there are a lot of people at the Times who share those values and beliefs, but that there is even more people who are on the other side. And they were telling me, I'm nervous that if Donald Trump wins, we may see another 2020. We may see another return to some of the excesses and some of the abandonment of these foundational missions and principles that undergird their journalism. And they didn't know what they were going to do in that situation. And partly the reason that they don't know what they're going to do is there's not a lot of alternatives. Like if you work at the New York Times, if you work at the Washington Post, and you're an investigative journalist, or you're somebody who, has an extensive beat with a lot of resources at your fingertips to chase after the story, where do you go if you decide to quit the Times? There's just not a lot of other outlets, because the alternative media outlets that have sprung up, while I think that they're valuable and I want a diverse landscape, I think that journalism can be a lot of things. I don't want a world where there's no partisan journalism. I don't want a world where there's no opinion journalism. It all has its place. I just think we need at least a few places that are, not partisan and that are dedicated to telling the truth and all of its complexities. It can't all just be left-wing stuff, right-wing stuff, heterodox stuff, woke stuff, right? But I think a lot of the alternative media outlets are ideological one way or another. And so they don't make for a good fit for somebody who maybe wants to cling to that mission. So their best bet is just to stay there and weather through the storm. Now, I don't see signs yet at places like the Times that they are going to go resistance. I was just talking yesterday to an old colleague who is still very much in a position of power at the Times' newsroom. And, she was really encouraged by what she's been seeing from them in the wake of Donald Trump's reelection. So cross our fingers and hope that these institutions can continue to withstand the internal turmoil. But then that's all just dealing with the internal stuff. There is also the external stuff, right? If you are on Threads or Blue Sky and these kind of more left-wing spaces online, for the past year, you have been seeing people publicly cancel their subscriptions to the Washington Post, publicly cancel their subscription to the New York Times, because they don't feel like those papers are taking this moment seriously enough, that they aren't being oppositional enough to Trump and those forces. You see them being accused of engaging in both sidesism, and we have to reject that. This is an emergency, and they essentially want a more biased media. And if enough people do that, it does have an effect on these companies, because at the end of the day, they have to generate enough revenue to continue to function. That's something that I think is really uncertain too. I'm with you. I think that there's a lot of people out there who, when they tune into NPR, they're like, wow, this has really changed. I miss it when it wasn't constantly lecturing me and wasn't constantly so obviously biased. You hear a story about any hot button issue on NPR these days: immigration, race, the economy, transgender issues. Absolutely. Number one. There's no mystery around who the reporter thinks is the good guy and the right guy, and who's the bad guy and the wrong guy in these stories, right? There's no ambiguity. There's no attempt, I think, to understand why people have a different point of view. And I think some people are frustrated with that. No matter what your politics are, I think there's a lot of people out there who want to understand, why is this debate so hot right now? Like, why are so many people debating about this issue? And to report on that, you have to accurately show why people have come to hold different views. You can't just say, this is the right view and here's a sympathetic story and we'll put the music in. And that's not helpful at the end of the day of really trying to grapple with why some debate is happening. I mean, this is, the inspiration in a lot of ways for the podcast series we did, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. We were up to a lot of different things there, trying to understand the human impulse to scapegoat and to mob up and, kind of witch trials like behaviors. But we were also trying to say there's been this debate happening around transgender rights, transgender identity, this debate about one of the most important things in a human society, which is how do we understand sex and gender, right? And most people don't really know all the different sides in this debate because they're only hearing one side of it, depending on the side that they hold. Oftentimes, they're just hearing, yes, that's the right side. And you don't need to get into the details about the other side. It's not important. Just know that they're wrong. And we thought, well, what if we try in good faith to show a number of different people with a number of different views who feel like they have something really at stake in this debate? Let's just show, how did they come to those views? Why are they important to them? And I think that it's a really powerful thing if you listen to the series, that you walk away having a better understanding of why this isn't easy, why it's not clear to the population, oh, we should just do this. It's no, this is really complicated stuff that intersects with the deepest parts of who we are as a society and the deepest parts of how certain individuals understand themselves. We need to show some grace and we need to show some empathy and we need to really wrestle with things. We can't just jump to the melodrama like we were saying before. The good guys, bad guys, clear right, clear wrong. It doesn't work with so many of the hot button issues that our society is facing right now.
I want to do my best to steelman the other side on this, even though I am very biased towards everything you just said and a big fan of your work. But if I recall a term coined by Wesley Lowery, a reporter who's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and he coined the term moral clarity. He said that neutral objectivity, quote unquote, in journalism had failed because it hasn't lived up to the needs of our current moment. And in an essay he wrote for the New York Times in 2020, he quotes Alex S. Jones, not to be confused with the other Alex Jones. Alex S. Jones served as a longtime director of Harvard's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. And he once wrote, quote, "I define journalistic objectivity as a genuine effort to be an honest broker when it comes to news. That means playing it straight without favoring one side when the facts are in dispute, regardless of your own views and preferences," end quote. But he also said, objectivity, quote, "also means not trying to create the illusion of fairness by letting advocates pretend in your journalism that there is a debate about the facts when the weight of truth is clear," end quote. And he also said, "He said, she said reporting, which just pits one voice against another, is the discredited face of objectivity," in his words. And this is something that I struggle with myself because I'm not sure exactly where the line is between trying to remain neutral and objective and doing I don't know, he said, she said with, let's say it's back in the 1950s and you're what are the pros and cons of keeping schools segregated in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, right? I guess where's the line in your view between when a reporter needs to step in and say no, this is the right thing. This is the correct truth, right? To go back to an earlier example I gave, the hypothetical, this was a bad mom. She abused her child, right? When is it correct to step in and say that and say your politics and where you stand on this issue versus when an issue is still up in the air? Because there would be people who would say to something you just said, Andy, which is, no, the issue on transgender rights and the transgender issue, that's done. We've settled that. And anyone who disagrees with what we believe is on the wrong side of history. How do we know when something is still up in the air and both sides still deserve to be heard? And how do we know when it's settled? And to use the Brown versus Board of Education example, no, these people are racists who just don't want black people in their white schools.
Well, it's a complicated answer because, as I said, I think that there are many ways of being a journalist. And I believe that a healthy society has a diverse landscape when it comes to journalism. I think that there's room for activist journalists. I think that there's room for opinions journalists. And that means that there are going to be some journalists out there who are in the game of persuasion, right? They're trying to persuade their audience through their reporting, through their prose, to hold a position that they believe is right and just. And I don't want to say that there's no place for that. In fact, I think that you have to have that in a good society. I'm just saying that I think that we need some journalism that is committed to values like objectivity, fairness, independence, that is not always engaged in persuasion on these issues, but is instead engaged in informing the public in a way that they can come to their own conclusions. I think that the Wesley Lowery moral clarity conversation is an interesting one, but I'll just point out that it depends on the morals of the reporter, right? And of the institution. Both the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, which I'll just, in full disclosure, say I helped to make one of the episodes of that podcast for the New York Times, so I was involved in that. That was pushed by moral clarity. That was not nuanced. That was not an attempt to better understand all the nuance. No, that was a moral clarity, mission-driven project, right? But also, Bari Weiss's The Free Press is also built on moral clarity. She just has different morals. She just has different concerns. And those things are fine. I'm glad that they exist in the world, but I don't want them to be the only things that exist, right? We can't just have the Bari Weisses and the Nicole Hannah-Joneses out there, even though they're great and they're interesting, and I don't want to, demonize them at all. I don't think that they're the most helpful. I don't think that that kind of journalism is the most helpful. And I worry that if it's the only kind of journalism that we have on offer, that the sort of pluralistic, peaceful society that I want us to be is going to struggle. Let's take the example, like you were saying, around segregation. I, as a journalist who am committed to these values, I don't think I need to say ever that segregation is wrong or that segregation is right. I just need to tell a story, a true story that grapples with the outcomes of the policies of segregation. And then when you see...
The facts speak for themselves.
Exactly. This happened just recently with the joke at Madison Square Garden about Puerto Rico.
Island of garbage.
Exactly, right? There was this big hullabaloo inside of newsrooms because there are some people who thought it was really important to say in the headlines, this was a racist joke. We have to call that joke racist because that's what it was. Well, I personally think that it is more powerful when you just tell me the joke. Just say, this was a provocative joke. This was an off-color joke. I don't think you need to go all the way to calling it racist. When you spell out the joke, let me make up my own mind if it's racist or not. And I think plenty of people would. And I think that by going that next step to tell me actually this thing is good or this thing is bad, when you don't just tell me what's going on and allow me to come up with my own point of view, I think that it breeds a sense of distrust. We especially see this, yet again, one of the reasons I'm interested in the conversation around sex and gender is because of how high the stakes feel for a lot of the people who are there and how absolutely difficult of a subject that is to grapple with if all you have is the moral clarity style of journalism out there. I was just listening to my favorite radio show in the country. It's called The Brian Lehrer Show. It's out of WNYC, my old employer. It's just awesome because it's a call-in show where you get to hear all these different voices and all these different characters from New York weighing in on all these different political issues. And, Brian Lehrer is pretty far to the left when it comes to social issues. And yet he's also just such a gracious host and really a good listener. But in the episode that I was listening to yesterday, they had a caller come in who has transgender members of their family and was saying that it's been really hard for her in the wake of the Democrats trying to grapple with their loss to Donald Trump, when some of these Democrats are saying, we have been unwilling to meet people in the debate around transgender identity. We're either trying to cancel them or we're ignoring them instead of trying to listen to them. And she said that her fear is that that's going to allow hate speech, and that's going to allow further prejudice against trans people and gender nonconforming people that she loves. And she was getting emotional in the call. And Brian Lehrer jumped in and he said, this is really difficult because there's this idea out there that there are only two genders. And he says, and that's hate speech. That is hate speech. And we can't allow that. Well, as much as I love Brian and as much as I have sympathies and I also want to fight against prejudice, the idea that there are only two genders, it is not agreed that that is hate speech. That is actually what a majority of people on planet Earth believe. It may be hate speech. I'm not saying it's not. I'm saying it's not my job as a journalist in the style of journalism that I do to tell you whether or not that's hate speech. But I do think it's my job to say that these people think that it's hate speech. These people feel really offended, and let's get to the root of why that's offensive to them. But let's also make sure that we're saying this is a view that is held by a majority of people in the world, by a majority of people in our country, and they don't hold it lightly. It's also important to them that they hold this belief. And so we have to grapple with this. We can't just say as journalists, I call it hate speech, therefore it is. I think that that breeds a sense of distrust. I don't think that it helps our pluralistic society to flourish and to function the way that we want it to.
Yes. And I imagine that it's something that had you asked Brian 10 years ago, if there were two genders, he wouldn't have said it was hate speech. I think one of the big problems that we're grappling with, I was just looking at a graph that kind of illustrated this earlier today. If you live in the Arctic and you talk to someone who's living in Los Angeles, that person living in the Arctic would say to the person living in Los Angeles, you live in a really hot climate. But then the person living in Los Angeles would look to the person living in the Middle East or the Sahara Desert, and the person in LA would say to the person in the desert, you live in a really hot climate. What both those people are saying is true, but it's contingent on where they are. So the person living in the Arctic, everything is hotter than where they live because where they're living is extremely cold. And it feels like politically, a lot of people have moved to the Arctic over the last 10 years. And then they're looking at people who live in temperate climates and saying that they live in the desert. But the people living in the temperate climate are looking at the people in the Arctic and being like, no, I think you just live in a place that's surrounded by ice. From like where they're standing, everyone outside of them looks a certain way. You know, like whenever I hear the phrase far right now, I don't even really know what it means. Because if you're very far left, but you think that you're centrist, everyone to the right of you does appear far right. But if you actually look at where the average American voter lands on the political spectrum, that is like 80% of the country would be labeled far right under that label.
Exactly.
And I think it's really warping how we understand each other. And I think that your example of the idea that saying there are two genders is hate speech is a really perfect example of that phenomenon.
Honestly, I love being the kind of journalist that I am, not just in my profession, but this is like how I'm grappling with the world. It fits so well into my status as a former fundamentalist. The kind of journalism that I practice is anti-fundamentalist. It's just not my job to tell you if there are or aren't only two genders. That's not a thing that I think people want a reporter to be telling them. Instead, I'm just going to say, wow, this is a really fascinating debate. And let me show you all the fascinating insights that I have dug up in my reporting. Let me introduce you to people who hold different views and in good faith, unpack those views so that you, dear listener, or you, reader, can grapple with them. Isn't that a more interesting world? Isn't it? Isn't just like a more fun approach to have? And of course, somebody who's, staunchly on one side or the other might hear this and say, well, it must be fun for you. I'm over here fighting for my survival. And I hear you. I just think at the end of the day, you want some journalists like me out there who are able to talk to people who hold different points of views, who try very hard to get people to at least acknowledge that there are views other than their own out there. I mean, this is like the definition of a bigot is somebody who is intolerant of views that they don't hold. That's what bigotry is. And we only fuel bigotry when we constantly are looking to understand only one side of an issue. You don't have to agree. This is a thing that Megan Phelps Roper, my friend and who is the host of the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, this is a thing that she always talks about. You can listen to people who you disagree with. You can even love people who you disagree with. You can even find a point of view that you don't hold to be fascinating and worthy of your time and attention. It's not agreeing with people to listen to them. And they aren't incompatible. And in fact, one of the reasons that Megan Phelps Roper is such an amazing person to talk to about these things is that she grew up in the Westboro Baptist Church. And that fundamentalist, closed-minded way of seeing the world is what allowed her to go out into the streets with signs that said, God hates fags, and think that she was doing the right thing because she had such an intolerance built into her worldview that said you can never ever listen to a point of view that you don't agree with. You can't think it's interesting to grapple with a view you don't hold. She's saying, like, that's how I used to be, and look what I did. This thing that she now deeply regrets. And I just think that she's an amazing voice in this kind of conversation.
Yes. And while I wasn't, thankfully, ever a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, I did really connect with something that you wrote about that period of time in which you had belief. And you said, quote, that you once believed that those who didn't share my exact views were damned to hell, end quote. And I definitely remember what that felt like when I held that view. I didn't think it was that harsh a view at the time, because when you believe in your heart that God is real and that his word is true and that he has your best interest at heart, I mean, that's what drives evangelism, right? You want to convert everyone else to Christianity, to your religion, so that they are also saved and that they can bask in his glory after death and you can all be together forever, right? Like, I know that my mom and dad listen to this podcast, but when I told my parents in my early 20s that I no longer believed in God, I think one of the first things that my mom told me in tears was that she couldn't imagine a life without me in heaven because she would miss her son, right, after death. And when you believe that, right, and when you believe that like a non-believer either won't be with you in heaven or is damned to hell, and then the journey that you and I went through, Andy, that falls away. And you realize that this way that you felt about other people, that you were so convinced that they were wrong and you were right, and that they would be damned to the worst possible fate because you were right and they were wrong. Once that like shatters and that becomes like a core element of who you are, I feel like I fundamentally understand what drives you and what keeps you from embracing certainty in your journalism when others might. Because I think when you have that kind of transformative experience at a young age of thinking you were so goddamn right about something and then realizing you were absolutely wrong about it, that you can't ever look at the world that way again.
Yeah, I can really relate to that experience you had with your parents. And I'll just say, especially if they're listening to this now, when I left the certainty of my fundamentalist Christianity, I was tempted briefly to be equally certain that there was no God and that everything that I had learned was all horseshit. And then I realized, wait, I'm just doing the exact same thing again. And I have tried to take a posture that, maybe they are right. I don't know. Maybe there is a God, there is a heaven. Maybe there is something really surprisingly amazing and magical and wonderful about the Christian story. And Jesus really did these miracles. I don't know. That's not absolutely impossible, because I no longer live in a world where I'm going to fall into that kind of certainty. I don't want to go from being a fundamentalist Christian to a fundamentalist atheist. I think that instead I'm just trying, as a person who once planted my flag in the ground so strongly and said, I am certain, I'm just saying, like, I'm not putting this flag anywhere anymore. I'm okay living in a world with a lot more doubt and with a lot more grace and a whole lot more humility. I think humility is the key value here, that just recognizing that you are one person who's been on this one journey through life and you are seeing just a thin reed of reality, and you're being shaped by everything from your genetics to your diet to the experiences you have day in and day out. I just think the arrogance of thinking you have it all figured out. I don't care if that's a religious arrogance. I don't care if that's a political arrogance. It is not helpful. You are definitely wrong about something. I am definitely wrong about something. And I think in just a embrace of that is a part of being a more enlightened and I think happier person. But I definitely think that bringing that value into journalism is a net positive for a society. Even though, as I keep saying, I like reading and consuming opinions journalism. At the New York Times, they have Michelle Goldberg, who's an opinion columnist on the left, who does a lot of reporting in her columns. And she engages in argumentation and persuasion towards the politics that she holds. And I think she does it so well. I think Michelle Goldberg is an awesome columnist. Whether you agree with her or not, it's just great to consume her work. I also think that Bret Stephens and Ross Douthat, conservative columnists at the Times, I think that they do the same thing. They do reporting and they do persuasion for politics on the right. I think it's a good world where you can consume Michelle and Brett and Ross, and they will help you understand the world through their eyes, and it makes it a more vivid and interesting world. I still want that stuff to be out there. I just think it can't only be that. We also need a portion of our diet, a place on the landscape of journalism for people who are not constantly engaging in persuasion, who are not coming to the positions they hold with the arrogance of certainty.
Yes, the arrogance of certainty. I really like that. Yeah, I went through my angry atheist phase in my early 20s. I was responding to like a deep pain that I felt by the hole that had been caused by my absence of faith. And I really did rail against, I really got in a lot of arguments with religious people, I think because I was so upset with myself. But I've kind of settled into a much more mellowed out agnostic approach. And I'm open to religion being true. And I think it has a lot of value. And I think to a point that you made on the Smoke 'Em If You Got 'Em podcast with two guests of this show, Sarah Hepola and Nancy Rommelman, where you expressed concern for how we're kind of dismantling religion in the United States, but we're not being very considered in thinking about what we're going to replace it with.
Absolutely.
And I can't help but look at the many, many in this house we believe signs that I see on lawns around our neighborhood and just think, well, that's another kind of catechism.
Yes, absolutely. I think that politics has definitely filled a space that religion used to fill, and that we are engaging in some of the unhealthy practices associated with politics now that we used to engage in unhealthy practice of religion. But I think that the trouble is that as much as, like I said, I was happy to abandon the arrogance of certainty that came with the style of Christianity that I practiced. I also am so glad that I was raised with some of the values. Not all the values. I don't love all the values I was raised with, but some of those values are incredible.
Yeah.
And the fact that we got together weekly to sing about those values, that we had a structure of storytelling that helped us to grapple with the way that living those values looks over time. The fact that we had a real community to turn to in times of distress, times of turmoil, that was all so awesome. The fact that, week in and week out, I was told that I was a Christian and that a part of being a Christian is that you tell the truth, even when it gets you in trouble. You're honest. The fact that I was told that being a Christian meant being forgiving, even to people who don't ask for it. You are going to be forgiving because that's what Christ has called you to do. That's what Christ exemplified. That's a really good value. And it's just a really good practice to articulate out loud what values you and your community hold, right? And I think that that's sorely absent from the sort of political obsessions that have come in to fill that space. If you talk to these super online, very politically engaged news consumers, I don't care if they're on the left or the right, if they're MAGA, whatever. And you just ask them, like, what are the values that are undergirding all this? What are the core values that are at place? I think a lot of them would be caught off guard. They're not thinking of it. They're not aware of it. And then if they started to articulate some of those values and you said, okay, I'm going to look through your social media posts. Do you think I would see evidence of this value in the post you've been making? I think they'd go, well, maybe not, And I don't say that to shame them. I just think that it's much bigger than any individual. We as human beings are very social, and we need, I think, some sort of structures to help us to grapple with what a good life is, what values are worth living by, and help articulate them and really to build up a exercise, for lack of a better word, the same way that we should be sweating every day and exercising every day. It's healthy for our bodies. Like, it's healthy for us as individuals and communities and a society to have an exercise in grappling with our values and how those values that we claim to hold interact on a day-to-day basis with the actions that we live out.
Do you think that there's value, saying this as an agnostic person myself, but it's something I've been grappling with lately. I'm almost wondering if there's a utilitarian value to having something religion-esque that can provide a simplified story of the world, that part of our brain that craves that can latch onto, that would allow us to more objectively approach things like politics and news, etc. In the absence of having the good versus evil story of the world, this is what gives life meaning. story that religion used to kind of fill? Are we instead looking for that story in our political figures and our news stories?
And influencers?
Yeah. And map that simplified story of the world out in the real world with our yard signs. Maybe what I'm saying is insane, but it feels like there's a hole that we're trying to fill that maybe needs to be filled by something. And it almost feels in a way we're filling that with something less healthy by trying to make our political figures Jesus rather than, a story from a 2,000-year-old text.
I think that you're onto something. And I think that it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I mean, if we talk about, unhealthy things that are coming in to fill real needs that we have, and talking about Christianity, I don't think we should ignore the fact that the New Apostolic Reform movement is a branch of Christianity that is the fastest growing branch of American Christianity right now. And they have very political views. They are incredibly pro-Trump. They believe that Donald Trump and the people around him have been appointed by God. They believe that there is a spiritual war that has been ramping up, and that the demons and the angels are very much present in these conversations about wokeness and anti-wokeness. And they are blending together elements of the Christian story, especially the parts of it that are fighting against the forces of evil, and this political moment where, there's a number of people who think that the woke education system is attempting to spread a mind virus amongst their children. And they're seeing their numbers grow even as church attendance drops in other places. I don't know what's going to happen next. Are we going to see the New Apostolic Reformation movement grow and grow, and to the point where it becomes as big as evangelical Christianity? Is that the society we want? I don't know. I think that it's on the rise. We should notice it and report about it accurately and with empathy, and not with, the sort of like finger wagging judgmental stuff alone. I think we should really try and grapple with why it's answering a call for so many people and report accurately on it. But I don't know what's going to come next. I once again turn back to history to say what's happened in the past. And in the past, you had some pretty big intellectual societal movements happen around books, important books that were published, important works that were published. You had a lot of intellectual debate in the world of politics from letters and from newspaper articles, especially in the 18th and 19th century. Does that mean that we're going to start seeing this through the influencers and the TikToks and the Reels? I don't know. Maybe so. I don't know what form it might take. I do think that there is right now such a poverty of media and material out there that is filling this need. And into that vacuum, something will step.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it will be. I just know that as a journalist, I'm going to try my best to use, the power of the media that I get to control, just to steer it in the direction that I want, which is to tell stories that I think are a reflection of good journalistic principles that are trying to grapple with the world as it is and help us see the issues that we face with clarity, and to help us understand people who are different than us and see them with more clarity. I think that those things are good, and I also think that they're just interesting. I think that there will be people who want that. I have reason to believe that based on the past success that we've had. If you go back and you listen to The Daily from the New York Times, I was a part of the team of three, me, Theo Balcom, and Lisa Tobin. We created The Daily 8 years ago. Exactly. We created that show. And if you go and you listen to it, a huge part of it was trying to understand why the politics of division had gotten to the point where Donald Trump had become elected president. And we knew that the New York Times readers who might be tuning into this podcast, we knew that many of them did not vote for Trump, and many of them probably didn't understand this, and that it wasn't just about Trump. It's been said many times, but it's true. Like, Trump is a very interesting figure, but he's more of a symptom of something than he is the cause of something, right? He's the thing that you can't ignore that brings up all these other interesting subjects. And that empathy-driven, curiosity-driven reporting that we did at The Daily was a massive hit. It was, the first podcast to knock Joe Rogan from the top spot in years. And of course, as a person who makes podcasts, I knew that because for years I'd been making podcasts and watching Rogan retain his number one status. And it felt good that not only did we get ourselves up into the number one spot, but that we were doing it with journalism that embraced these values. And of course, with the witch trials of J.K. Rowling, we saw that as well. We wondered, with the sex and gender and trans identities and trans rights, as sensitive as that subject is, will people appreciate a storytelling driven show that's truly trying in good faith to understand where everyone's coming from without pledging our allegiance to one side or the other? Like, will they want that? And it was massively encouraging to see that millions and millions of people said yes, that they did want that, that they appreciated that. And I think that it played a helpful role in a very difficult debate that our society is having right now. And so I'm going to keep going down and pursuing that and keeping my fingers crossed that it can, in its own small way, fill in that vacuum with something good, which is, as we started this conversation, good storytelling. We want good stories. We can't help it. We're obsessed with them. So let's try and do good storytelling with these values and maybe help in our own small way to make society more healthy. And I mean, just now that I'm on a rant, I just want to say this to you, Michael. I no longer believe in the afterlife. I say that as somebody who just has gone on a whole rant about how, I try and stay away from certainty. There totally might be one. It would be awesome if there's a heaven. That sounds great. But I'm not banking on it, right? That belief for me means that I am very aware that this is the only life I get. And I have this quote that I keep on my desk. I have it right here from the writer Annie Dillard, who's absolutely one of the best. And it just says, "How we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives." This is it. And I just want to pursue worthy efforts. This is the thing that feels worth my life's pursuit, to tell these kinds of stories and to do these things. And I want to, look back 20, 30, 40 years from now at this moment where all the polls showed that trust in journalism was super low, that people were just absolutely full of distrust, and know that the kind of journalism that I put out into the world was the sort of journalism that could help rebuild that trust. Whether I fail or not, I just want that peace of mind.
Second to last question, thinking about Reflector, which is an audio-only podcast. Are you and Matt planning on keeping Reflector audio-only? Do you see there being a visual element included? What do you think the future is for audio-only podcasts generally? Do you think it's a weird question to ask because podcasts have been literally defined by their exclusively audio component. But what do you think the future is and need for audio-only podcasts as we move into the future?
I think that people are always going to want audio-only stuff. I think that it has a long future. I think that the big problem is discoverability. I don't think it's that people prefer the video podcasts. It's just YouTube is brilliant. It's my favorite. I know I talked about Rabbit Hole and be careful and the algorithms. A huge part of Rabbit Hole was saying how dangerous the YouTube algorithm can be. And I agree, but also it's genius. When I go to YouTube, it's constantly giving me things that it thinks I want to see. And it's pretty right. It's often right. And therefore you can discover new voices and new media through the YouTube world that you just won't ever be able to do on Apple Podcasts. You won't be able to do on Spotify. And I think that's why you're seeing people go to video. It's not because the experience is so much better on a video podcast. It's that discoverability. And honestly, the power to go viral is more susceptible there. You're seeing people move there because of the algorithm. YouTube has changed the algorithm since we made Rabbit Hole. I don't think it is as irresponsible as it once was, even though I think we should all be aware and very careful about how much we allow the algorithm to serve us things and be very aware of what's happening as we engage in that. I think that the future of audio is still rich. It's just that we need to figure out how to solve the discoverability riddle. I think that the real trouble is for writing. There's a whole generation, the younger generation. You're seeing this with, college freshmen showing up having never read a book. People are not reading. My friend Megan Toohey just wrote this fantastic investigations story for the New York Times about all of the changes happening in the world of marijuana and how legalizing weed has led to just incredibly powerful legal weed being in the market, and how, there's a number of young people throughout America who aren't just smoking a little weed every day, but they are smoking this insanely potent, never seen before weed, and they're smoking it several times throughout the day. And essentially it's a piece that says that we need to change the conversation that we're having around marijuana and its legalization, because the drug itself is undergoing such stark changes from when we started having the conversation. But if you sit down to read Megan's piece, it'll take you an hour, maybe an hour and a half. It's a long, well-reported, very thoughtful piece. How many people do you think sat down and read that whole thing? I don't know exactly. When I was at the New York Times, they had a data team that uses metrics of how long you hover on the page and all that stuff to try and determine it. But I know for a fact, millions of people listened to that episode of The Daily, where Megan explained her reporting to Michael Barbaro, right? The audio future, I think, is in some ways more bright than the kind of digital print future, if we could solve the discoverability. But I also think that there's going to be new markets that emerge. I always joke that I didn't get into podcasts because they were cool. They're not cool. It's not cool to be a podcaster. I would never put podcaster on a dating app,
You must have thought it was a little cool when you were painting houses back in the day.
Well, what I was drawn to, one is, of course, the ability to multitask. I was working in a manual labor job, and the monotony of that job was enriched by being engrossed in great stories as I had to do that work. And I think that is a lot of the draw. I think a lot of Joe Rogan's audience originally were blue collar workers who had drudgery in their day-to-day job, and suddenly they had
a friend in their ear. Yeah,
exactly. It's interesting company. And I think that's obviously a part of the pool. But the other part of the pool is just that they were telling great stories that were in the style of the stories I wanted to tell. And it's okay, well, I'll learn how to tell them there, because I just love stories and want to find a place to put them in. I think people are going to continue to love those stories, and that we just have to find out what's the next medium where we can meet people where they are. The thing that I'm researching that I think is going to be really interesting to watch is going to be AI automated visualization. What might it be like to pair great investigative journalism, great storytelling with an AI created video visualization of some kind? There's a chance that it's something so fresh and new that it's weird at first. And then we all are talking about oh my God, can you believe that we didn't all know that was going to be the next thing? That's my hunch anyway.
You strike me as a very empathetic person, Andy. I can feel that at the core of your work. And I can't say that about everyone or most people. Even people who are genuinely empathetic in their day-to-day lives, I can't say that empathy drives their work. So I thought it would be appropriate to end this conversation with a question that was once a staple of this podcast, a question I used to ask every guest at the end of every episode, but I've since semi-retired it. But I want to ask it to you. As individuals, we're limited in our time, in our energy, and often in our capacity for empathy. Even the most well-intentioned, caring person can't be thinking of every person, every group of people all the time. It's impossible. So, Andy, is there someone or a group of people in your life or in the world at large right now that you would like to take a moment and offer empathy to?
Well, my first journalism job out of college was as a research journalist in South Sudan, and I spent 15 months in Sudan and Kenya and Uganda and DR Congo. I was struck by the timeline of my life overlaid with the timeline of my peers that I met there. On the one hand, I was pleasantly surprised at how much we had in common. I grew up in a really small town in America, and it turns out that there's a lot of commonality between small town folk in the Midwest and small town people in the bush of East Africa. But I also had to grapple with the fact that they are living with a level of poverty that makes our impoverished people here look wealthy. And I don't know how we in the West grapple with that. I've never figured it out. And I am guilty, as many people are, of forgetting about them, of in the day in, day out trials and tribulations of our lives, because everybody's life, no matter how wealthy or privileged you are, your life is going to be hard. That's just how life is. And it's harder for some than for others. And it doesn't matter if your heart is broken and you don't have enough money in your bank account here in the West, it doesn't matter how impoverished somebody in Sudan is. You still need to deal with your problem. You need to go, talk to your friends, see a therapist, save money, whatever it is you have to do. You can't just say, well, they're starving people somewhere, so my problem's not so big. I think that there's no wisdom in that. But I do think that we need to find a way to care more about our fellow man who, through no fault of their own, live on this planet with us in just like heartbreaking poverty. I mean, I'm like, my voice is cracking because I'm just thinking of like, it's shameful that we don't think of them, even me.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing because we're powerless. What can I do today that will make the life of the people who are living in this incredible poverty better? Probably nothing. And so, we don't do much of it. But I do think that we would be wise and that the world would be better and that our lives would be enriched if we could find some way collectively, we who are in the West, who have the medicines and the technologies of a sci-fi fucking movie, right? Like, it's crazy, the life that we're living right here. It would be great for us to find it within ourselves to have more empathy and to do something about the fact that many of our fellow man living in other parts of the world, they are sorely lacking in even the basics. And it's hard to know what to do, what that empathy would lead us to. Maybe just heartbroken on occasion, which is self-serving and probably not very helpful. But there's got to be something more that we can do. And I think that a future world where we do find more generosity and there's more equality is a better world.
There was something you said in an interview as I was preparing for this conversation in which you were describing Reflector. And you said, quote, "In a world where a lot of media is trying to get a quick reaction, what if we intentionally turn the other way and try to tell stories that are about deep reflection," end quote. And as we've discussed here today, and I think as many people out in the world would agree, in this moment, we need more deep reflection and fewer quick reactions. I think perhaps now more than ever, we desperately crave it like oxygen. I'm so grateful for the work that you and Matt are doing at Reflector because I think it's really important. But today, most of all, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Michael. This has been great.